I'm gonna hit record here and we'll officially get started. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to come and join myself and Caleb and Ben here. I'm gonna just kind of go over a couple of logistics really quickly, and then we'll tell you kind of what this whole call is about, and not just this call. Like we're at the start of a year-long experience that Ben has pulled together and rallied together for us here, and we're pretty stoked. And hopefully, coming out of tonight, some of you are going to be stoked to be a part of it and join with us here. So yeah, a couple logistics though before we fully dive in. Yeah, so it is being recorded, so just know that. If you want to go over, we'll have the chat kind of running there. I don't know how much I'll be looking in there, but feel free to say hey in there or chat in there amongst each other as things are going on, or if you got thoughts or questions as the night's going on, throw them down in there. Tonight's call is going to be about an hour and a half, kind of 7 till about 8:30ish. Yeah, we will send the replay out afterwards. So if you got a jet a little bit early and you want to watch it afterwards, or you know anyone that couldn't make it tonight that you think would have liked this experience, then feel free to share and kind of pass this around. These calls are going to be running once a month, basically for the next year. And they're going to be paired with a 1 day on the land experience. Actually, some of the days in the fall might actually be multi-day experiences. But at least for the winter and into the spring, we're going to be meeting on the land 1 day a month. And we're hoping, as I said, that a bunch of you will be inspired to come join us kind of coming out of today's call. Yeah, well, I'll talk a little bit more about what those sessions are all about in a little bit here. Other logistical things. Oh yeah, I just wanted to mention, so some of these calls will probably be a little bit more on the interactive side, where we'll get people to actually kind of share and maybe even do breakout rooms or different things like that. Tonight is going to be a little bit more of a longer teaching that Caleb's doing that I'm really looking forward to. But just kind of let you know, some nights might be a little bit more interactive, other nights might be a little bit more, just some teachings being delivered. And a lot of these teachings are meant to kind of create some of the context for the stuff we're going to be doing on the land, so that when we get together on the land, we can kind of just get right down to, working skills and learning stuff, if we can kind of cover some of the theory, some of the context, some of the stories, even some of the cultural elements when we gather here around the virtual campfire here on Zoom. The only other logistical piece that I'll mention with that is just watch for an email from Chris Outdoors. I don't know if everybody got that one or not. I know Ben sent out an email with the link as well. But I will be sending out some of the links. I'll be sending out some of the info about the in-person stuff. And then if we reference kind of like follow-up resources, like from these classes or the in-person stuff, I'll be sending some of those out. So I should have messaged everybody here tonight. And what I find is sometimes if it's the first email you get from me, it might end up in your junk mail or in your promotions folder if you use Gmail. So if you didn't get an email from Chris Outdoors today, make sure you check your junk mail and your promotions and just kind of watch for that, or maybe flag it so it doesn't end up there. So I'll kind of leave it there. Anything I'm missing there for logistics, Caleb? Or
No, I think we're good.
Awesome. Awesome. So Caleb and I are going to introduce ourselves in a few moments here and kind of, tell you a little bit more about what this experience is about. And then I'm really going to pass it over to Caleb for the rest of the night. Caleb's joining us from Hiawatha tonight. I'm joining you from up in Muskoka, kind of up on the edge of Algonquin Park. But before we dive in, I want to do a little awareness prompt, and I also want to share a little story that provides a little context for kind of how I ended up in front of the screen here tonight and my relations to Ben and Caleb, and hopefully how that'll evolve into evolving relationships with some of you folks. So I'd like to invite everybody actually to take a moment and close your eyes just for a second here. I got a bit of an awareness activity for everybody. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. Maybe even just take a deep breath, kind of let go of the busyness of the day. I know all of us are probably coming from work. Maybe you're coming from dinner, whatever it is. So just take a second to kind of be present with what we're doing here tonight, And I kind of like doing this activity. I think of it as like, how do we bring the outside in when we're sitting in front of the screen and make sure that even though we're using tech right now, that we're still staying connected to the outdoors and to all those cycles. So I'm going to invite you right now to picture the moon in your mind's eye, in your head. But I don't want you to picture it at any stage. I want you to actually think tonight, what is the moon going to look like tonight on the sky? Which side of it is bright right now and which side of it is dark? Can you see that? How much of the moon is bright right now? How much of it is dark? What does it actually look like right now? If there's a little bit of a shadow on one side of it, is there an angle to it? Is it pointing straight up and down? Is it pointing on an angle? And I'll add one more layer to that. Point right now. where is the moon in this moment? Has it risen yet? And if it's risen, where in the sky are you seeing it? And if it hasn't risen yet, when is it going to rise? Where would it actually be roughly? See if you can actually point to it. Feel it right now. And I bring the moon into our awareness tonight and honor all of its gifts. It's amazing how many things the moon's connected to, you know, from the tides of the ocean to the hormones of humans down here and the animals down here. As a hunter, I think so much about how the moon impacts the deer, how the moon impacts the wolves, the coyotes, the patterns across the land, and how through most of human history, how much, you know, being in tune with the moon cycle was actually an essential part of our survival. You can open your eyes if you had your eyes closed there and come on back in. So I bring the moon into our awareness right now because it's kind of crazy. You know, some of you, I'd imagine, already have that deep connection to the moon, and that was maybe easy for you and something you already feel connected to. But I would imagine for some of you, maybe you haven't actually thought about that. Maybe you haven't even thought about that in a while. Like, where is the moon right now? What time is it going to rise? What phase is it in? You know, and how is that influencing everything else? As a hunter, I've been blown away by how much the wildlife behaviors change with the moon cycles and what phase the moon is. It impacts how the wolves move. It impacts how the deer move, how the raccoons move on the landscape. And, you know, for most of human history, it was essential for us to be that tapped into that cycle as well for our survival. And in a very short period of time, you know, modern people can go days, weeks, months, maybe even a whole lifetime with so little awareness of the moon. And that moon's related to so many different things. So I share that kind of awareness prompt tonight as a bit of kind of bringing us into the theme that we want to hold as we go forward with these 12 months of the Survive-O-Rama, we're calling it, the Land Stewardship Guild that Ben's putting together here, to really deepen our relationship to, our knowledge of, you know, all of these beings we share the planet with. In a real deep way. You know, that's part of the overarching teaching. And we're going to do that through, you know, land-based skills, things like wilderness survival and tracking and bushcraft and trapping and hunting skills and foraging and medicine, all these different ways that are just such powerful ways, life ways to connect with those ancient cycles. So I'm going to share one short story here, and then I'm basically going to pass it over to Caleb for the rest of the night. But it's a little bit of a story. I'm not going to tell you my long story of who I am. I think we're hopefully all going to get to know each other well in the coming months and over the coming year. I know a couple of you a little bit already. But I'll share a little bit of story that I think creates a little bit of relevancy tonight for you anyways, a short introduction. And it starts with how I met Ben. I think it was maybe 5, 6 years ago, maybe even 7 years, somewhere in that range, roughly. I was actually teaching at Fleming College, and Ben showed up there as a student. So he was taking an outdoor education program at the time, and I only taught this one class at the college, and I got invited to create this course, and it was called Applied Ecology. And as a former student of Fleming, it was a real honor for me to get to create this course because I got to bring something to the school that I really felt was missing when I was there. And I did my best to bring it the way that I could. And the essence of it, this, you know, Fleming is an outdoor ed school, but it's a very academic school. And I went there. That's where I learned a lot about tree identification. But I literally had to like decolonize my thoughts on trees afterwards. Because in Fleming, I got taught to like, what's the name of the tree? What's the Latin name of the tree? How do you measure it? How do you decide how much timber's in it? What can you do with it? And then how do we manage forests like in these like real regimented kind of Western ways? And, you know, honestly, there was some really cool stuff in there. And I don't even want to say that all of that was bad. But afterwards, like I had to stop looking at tree as like a commodity from my education there. And I had to retrain myself to bring back in that relational piece, you know, and recognize that a tree is so much more than a name. In fact, knowing the name of a tree doesn't really mean anything. Well, the English name anyways, you know. If you know the Anishinabek Moon name of it, you know a lot more than you do with, you know, the English name of that tree. So the program that I put together, I called Applied Ecology. And the essence of it was, let's weave in those other components, the idea that nature has a language and all of these things are in relation with each other and speak to each other. And there was two main components of this class that we kind of got into. One of them was tracking and the other was bird language. And when I talk about the tracking piece, you know, one element of tracking is identification. Like I see a footprint on the ground and I know that this was the lynx or this was the fisher or this was the mink that made it. But another element of tracking, and this is what I actually get really excited about and the part I'm more passionate about, is that every single footprint that's made was made by a living creature that's interacting with the earth and everything else around it. So tracking isn't actually just about who made that. It's not about just giving it a name. Tracking is about actually looking at the trail of tracks across the landscape and reading that like you would a storybook. And that tracks, when an animal walks across the landscape or a human walks across the landscape, their tracks are literally the written story of what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're being, what they're relating with. And as we learn to track, we actually learn to read the footprints as though they're letters in an alphabet that's telling us the unique details of that animal's life and how they're interacting. And that's the part of tracking that I'm particularly passionate about. So that was the one point of the course. The other component of it is what we call bird language. And again, bird language, when I went to Fleming, we had to learn to bird by ear. And birding by ear was like, oh, here I am, where are you? Here I am, where are you? Oh, that's a robin that's making that call, And then we call it a robin and we move on, and now I know the robin. But like knowing that here I am, where are you is a robin, I don't know anything about that being just from that alone, because when the robin's singing here I am, where are you, he's actually singing about something for real. Like those are actual words that he's conveying to the other birds and to the other animals. The robin might be singing about the weather about to change. It might be singing about a predator on the landscape and telling you where the coyote is or where the bear is or where the other people are, And for most of human history, our survival relied on us actually being able to know what the birds were saying. And I spent my first 20 years of my life in the woods, and I didn't even know that was a thing. Like it never even occurred to me that the birds were actually communicating information and that I might actually be able to read and interpret that. So I've been on a 20-year journey now. I'm actually a little bit more, I guess, because I'm 40, turning 45 this year. And it was about 25 years ago, I guess, I kind of had the wake up like, oh my goodness, there's this intricate language all around me. And I've been oblivious to it my whole life. And that became my life passion and my life work. So to kind of wrap up the story and bring Ben and Caleb into the picture, and then I'm going to kind of stop talking for the night and pass it on to Caleb. So now I'm teaching this class with Ben, and we're teaching bird language. And Ben Benson, hopefully most of you know Ben. You'll get to hear from him in some future weeks and calls, and he'll be with us in some of the in-person sessions. So Ben's in my class, and I can't remember what was the beginning of a class or at the end of a class, but Ben pulls me aside one day and he's like, Chris, I got to tell you this cool story. And I apologize if I don't have it perfectly here, Ben. It was quite a few years ago, but the essence of it was Ben told me he was out walking behind the school by himself one evening, and he noticed that the birds, because of what we were doing in the class, he noticed that the birds were actually acting differently off in the woods. And he had this thought, I wonder if those birds are actually alarming at something back there. What's going on? He's like, I'm going to actually sneak into the forest and see if I can see what's going on there. And he's like, I've never really done something quite like that before, but I just had this thought like, man, I want to know what the birds are like making this noise about. So I don't know whether he got on his hands and knees or whether he just snuck, but he basically snuck his way through the woods. And sure enough, there was a group of students hanging out in the woods, and the birds told him that they were there, even though he couldn't hear them. And then he came back and told me, and he's just all lit up and excited. He's like, that's the first time that's really happened to me quite like that. And I was just like, yeah, I'm so pumped, it just fired me right up, that level of awareness. And I don't claim by any means to be like, the master or the guru in this. I'm on my learning journey as well. I started late in life. I have so much to learn myself in this as well. But I share that story to tell you how I met Ben and what my passion is in this life. And I feel like a big part of my gift and my work in the world is to try and to continue on my own quest of developing those relationships and to share that with others. And in that sharing, we all kind of learn. So in bringing Caleb in tonight into this circle, I'm going to pass it over to you in just a second, Caleb, just to give you a heads up here. I'll just kind of finish with this. Caleb and I have known each other for quite a while now. I don't even remember exactly when we met. We've become quite good friends over the years. We teach quite a bit together now. And part of our connection was through both of us having this similar passion. Both of us are into bushcraft and wilderness survival and ecology and tracking and bird language. We're both hunters. We're both trappers. We both work trap lines in the wintertime. So we have a lot of relations around these things and have really connected over the year. And we're also both learning. And I guess I want to start off by acknowledging that I suspect that a number of you have gone on deep journeys in some of these areas as well. And maybe other parts of what we're going to cover, sorry about that. Other parts of what we're covering might be brand new to you. But I want to acknowledge just the collective wisdom in here, and share my excitement for the journey that we're going to go on together if you decide to stay on this journey with us. As I said, we're going to be meeting once a month online and then once a month in person. The first bunch of sessions are going to be down in Rama, and then I think there's some thoughts of maybe doing some traveling, potentially, going off with Caleb to go harvest monomen in the fall, or collect monomen, I should say, and gather and process, and getting into some really, really beautiful things. And it feels like an honor to be invited by Ben to come into your community and share my passion. And I'm excited to share, but I'm also excited to learn, because I know there's a lot of wisdom and experience that already exist in this room. And I think part of this journey, is me and Caleb kind of creating this container to learn, but I think we're all going to contribute to it and grow together, and walk a good walk in a good way. And that's what excites me. So hopefully some of you guys are feeling that journey, guys and gals. And yeah, I'll leave it there. If I keep talking right now, I'll probably start rambling. So I should probably pass it over to Caleb. We'll get to know y'all. I'm not going to say too much else tonight. Caleb's going to kind of take the show from here. But for those of you that do decide to, oh, he just got booted. I got to bring him back in. I guess I do have to talk for another moment. For those of you that do decide to join us in person, watch for those emails from Chris Outdoors. If you're not getting emails, make sure you message Ben, and he'll make sure that you are. And I'm going to leave it there and pass it over to you, Caleb, for the evening.
Good timing with that, because my computer just turned right back on, thankfully. I forgot that I had my computer unplugged and it just dropped. So I had to quickly plug everything back in to get back in here. Sorry about that, folks. So, Anin Bojo, Kinunene Dijnakas, Bazuna Shindorem, Shisaga Nishinabe, and Dao Pimera Shkodeang and Donjaba, Bojo, Winana Bojo. My name is Caleb from Mississauga's of Rice Lake, aka Hiawatha, aka Pimera Shkodeang. And my background is a lot of different hats being worn. I work in archaeology, I work in ecology, and I work in bushcraft. I teach traditional living skills of our people, as well as those from settler heritage. And in all those journeys and all that time learning and studying and teaching it, I've come to realize a lot of things over the years. And when I was younger and first learning this stuff from like my mentor Gino and Morris Kohansky and people like Chris, who I've known for 16, actually it's 20, 25 now. So like this coming fall, I've known Chris for 17 years, I think, which is a terrifying thought. But anyways, out of all these people who've taught me, and then learning beyond those people and practicing on my own, and studying our culture and listening to our elders talk, there's a lot of things that I've realized are completely impregnated into our culture, completely immersed. Like no matter what, if you want to learn the language, you need to know the land. And if you want to know the land, you got to learn your language. Like the trees, the animals, all their names explain who they are, their actions and their interactions and their relationships and interrelationships. And over the years, I've taught a lot of really cool people. I think I did the math a couple of years ago. I've taught over 20,000 people in total. That is not a boasting thing. That's just like how many people have had to hear me talk, which I feel sympathy for all of them, because I have to hear myself talk once in a while and it drives me nuts. But on a regular basis, I get the question, especially since that show alone came out. We're in like the 11th season of that show, where people get dropped off in the wilderness. They got to survive and see how long they can survive. I get it asked a lot from people who are, just regular civilians, from university folks, but also actually people who've been on that show. When do you think is the best time to get dropped off in the wilderness? And I always never had an answer for it, because it's so hard to answer that question. Like, yeah, summertime is easier because you don't need the fire to keep you warm, but you're inundated with mosquitoes and black flies. Like I was in Rama back in June with Chris and Ben for our very first like pilot project workshop. And I got to say, your mosquitoes are terrifying. And I was born in James Bay. I'm from Northern Ontario, and your mosquitoes in Rama are just something else. So picture summertime with no fire to provide smoke. And even if you do have smoke, I don't know. Like I honestly don't know if Rama mosquitoes would care if you had a smoky fire or not. I think they would just come flying through the smoke and get you anyways. And so there's all these parts of like, yeah, that would be a good time to get dropped off, but not really. And over the years, I started to look at like our history and our ways of life and our what's referred to as life ways, and realize there is no good time to get dropped off in the wilderness alone, because you're already going to be in a deficit. Every month gives you something to prepare you for the next month. Everything. Whether it's, Zine Sabakwat in March, April, when the sugar is finished, the maple sugar is completed, that gives you the energy for the rest of the year. That sugar is the only real sugar you get for the rest of the year. And people argue, yeah, you can, but what about berries? There's not that much sugar in berries. I'm diabetic and I'm okay eating berries. If if they had a lot of sugar in them, I would not be okay eating berries. So we have to look at all of them. If we jump ahead to June, yeah, we have the warmth and it's easy to peel bark and all those things, but we missed the fish runs. We missed the walleye, we missed the sucker, we missed the chub suckers, all these other fish that would be providing us a lot of the protein for that summertime. If you get dropped off in October, well, you missed Menominee-Keagizes, you missed the ricing period, which gives you the most amount of calories you can possibly get other than the sugar. Menomin is easy to harvest. Menomin, well, pick or gather. It's easy to process, and there's a lot of it out there in the right places. And so no matter what time of year it is, you're always going to be in a deficit. And that started to make me really admire our people and our teachings, because we have an answer to all of that, and that is the 13 Moons calendar. And that is what this whole program is kind of based around. When Chris and Ben and I sat down to hash out this whole idea of how this program was going to go, and the original thought was like, yeah, we'd like to get together once a month for the full year. It dawned on us, the calendar is already set up. We just have to schedule it. All the things that we need to learn are already laid out in front of us in the 13 Moons system. And so, to help explain kind of how the syllabus is going to work in a sense, I'd like to go over the calendar for the year, the 13 Moons calendar. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I've sent a request to share my screen. I guess I'm not a co-host yet. One day I'll be cool enough to be a co-host. All right. So I'm going to open. Let's see. There we go. We're going to go into slideshow presentation. Can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Awesome. All right, that's just our title screen. So the 13 Moons, the Survive-A-Rama Land Stewardship Guild. I made this specially for y'all. Yeah, we'll move forward now. So our Anishinabek calendar consists of 13 months, also known as moons, that are 28 days each. The scoots on a turtle's back give us those teachings. So there's a lot of teachings of where they came from. The one that I grew up hearing was when Anabojo was trying to pick how the whole year would work, and picked up a turtle and just noticed that there was always, no matter what kind of turtle it was, 13 primary scoots and 28 rin scoots. So if you look at a turtle's back, a painted turtle, a snapping turtle, even those red-eared sliders from down in Florida that have been brought up and are introduced into our territory, they also have this same system where there's 13 primary scoots on the back and 28 going around the rim. It's an easy way to remember. Our calendar is everywhere that we live. The Mekanak, the Meshikan, they tell us where it is and what we're doing. These moons coincide with natural happenings on the land, and as such, their names will describe to us the most important information we didn't know to survive and thrive on the land. When we talk about, like I said earlier, if you know the land, you can be, if you know the language, you can be on the land. And if you know the land, you can be, it's easier to learn the language. It really does go that deep. One of my first times teaching for myself, like when I was a little kid, I was hanging out in Saugeen First Nation. That's where I grew up. And we had this phenomenal knowledge holder. He was a chief for quite a while, named Vernon Rootba, passed away 2 summers ago, sadly. And he used to run these language classes on Saturday mornings in the library in Saugeen. And I'd be going out and taking courses every other weekend with all kinds of people that were teaching survival stuff and bushcraft stuff. And they were mostly Jaganash. And Vern kept saying, like, if you could just come and take the language classes, you'll know all you need to know to survive. And I was like, nice try, Vern. I'm not going to hang out with a bunch of old ladies in a basement of the library on a Saturday morning when I can go out and shiver for hours on end and be starved and being swatting mosquitoes nonstop. That just sounds ridiculous. Sure enough, I start teaching for myself with my company, Canadian Bushcraft, and we start having students coming out. And one of them was a young lady. She was Jaganash herself. She wasn't Indigenous. And when I was pointing out the uses of trees, she goes, well, what's the name of them? I was like, ash. And she goes, no, what is it in the language? I'm like, well, Agamuk, I think. And she goes, well, what does Agamuk mean? I'm like, ash. She's like, you don't have a word before the word ash? I'm like, oh, well, Agim is a snowshoe, and Ak is probably talking about the wood. And that is a good wood to use for snowshoes. Then we got to the next tree, and it was a basswood, Tilia americana. And she said, well, what's the name for that in the language? I was like, wigop. She goes, well, what does that mean? I'm like, something to do with rope. And she's like, well, is that how you use it? I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how you use it. You take the bark off the tree, you soak it in the swamp for a few weeks to a few months, and you get these real fine fibers that you can twist into rope that's very strong. She's like, wow, that's incredible. I'm like, yeah. And we get to the next tree, and before she can even ask, I said, in the language, this is a Matigwabuk. It's a hickory tree. She goes, well, what does Matigwabuk mean? Like, well, Matigwab is a bow, like a hunting bow. And Og, or Og again at the very end, is talking about wood. She's like, wow, it's like your language was designed to help you survive on the land. And I stood there feeling like a complete idiot that I had skipped all those language classes every Saturday morning with Vernon. So that is like how deep it is into our language and into our identity of how to live on the land, not just survive on the land, but thrive on the land. And so to understand it all, we got to understand how the calendar works. So in Western society's calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar, the first moon would be January. So that would be like their first year, like New Year's Day just happened a couple of weeks ago. But that's not our worldview. That came from Christians arguing with one another when to start their calendar off. They didn't want their holidays to coincide with the Jewish holidays that they were seceding from. So they didn't want them to coincide. They didn't want, Easter to land on Passover, and they didn't want Hanukkah and Christmas to coincide. So they had to change their calendar and completely revamp it. And it got revamped multiple times. Like, this was all because of politics, in a lack of a better term, to form their calendar. Our calendar was formed by the land. From our worldview, the first moon of the year would be when life returns to the land, which is Zigwan, early spring. As with all land-based perspectives, the names of the moons depend on the region you're in. As such, some moons have several names, and some moons happen later in northern areas, and some moons happen sooner in southern areas. You got to remember, Anishinabek Waking goes all the way above the Great Lakes, all the way as far as Saskatchewan, all the way down into Michigan and Minnesota, Wisconsin. And for the Potawatomi or Potawatomi people, even all the way down into Indiana. Like, it's a big area. So some areas, the sap is going to run sooner. The sap is going to run later. The fish are going to spawn sooner. The fish are going to spawn later. That's just part of the whole process. So your mileage may vary, and you may hear different names for these times. That's okay. They're all the same at the end of the day. It's still the 13 moons. So with that out of the way, the first month or first moon of the year is Zinzabakwadok Gizis, which is the sugaring moon, or gathering of sugar. Late February, early March, depending on the region and conditions. In northern regions, this could even be early April. Winter camps were moved to the sugar bushes, and we would begin tapping the trees. So you would start off in your winter camp, and your winter camp would be small family units off on the land trapping for the winter time. And a lot of people think that you would move south to get to the warmer weather, but the further south you go, the more open the forests become, and the colder they actually get in a lot of senses because of wind chill factor. When you get up into the boreal forest, up into the conifer trees, you have that hedgerow effect, slowing the wind down so it's not as freezing cold in your camps. And the trees help hold some of the snow off the ground, making it easier to move around. And some of the best fur is in the North Country. So if we're out trapping to get fur to keep ourselves warm, and this is even before the fur trade, not just because we were trapping for the European settlers, but before then we trapped in the North and stayed in the North. So my family's trap line and winter camp wasn't down here on Rice Lake in southern Ontario. It was actually up closer to Algonquin Park, starting over in Potash, Ontario, and moving all the way over to Drag Lake in Halliburton. So we moved all the way up there to stay for the wintertime. And when it was time for sugaring, we would move our way back down to the sugar camps. Now, once you got to the sugar camps, you would hunt porcupine. The reason being is what would often happen, depending on the time frame and the time period, Anishinabek would leave a lot of our families in the winter camps and they would prepare the nets. A lot of the women would take thousands and thousands of feet of cord made of dogbane, hemp dogbane specifically, to weave into the fishing nets that we needed for later in the season. And so they didn't have time to go and boil sap. So it was often our men, our teenagers, and those kids who were old enough to go out with them. And we would leave all the food for the elders, the women, the little children who couldn't take care of themselves or they were having to focus on other tasks. We'd leave all the remaining food with them, and we would move ahead of them like a scout unit up ahead. And when we got there, we left all that food behind, so we would hunt the porcupines. There's a few reasons we would hunt the porcupines. First off, they're really easy to hunt. So much so that it's illegal in much of Canada to kill porcupine because they are such an easy animal to kill. It's easy to wipe out a population, but also so that if someone was trapped in the woods, whether it was a bush pilot back in the 1930s when bush planes were crashing all the time, trapper who gets injured on their trap line, whoever may be, have those animals available that they could easily kill without a firearm or a bow or another more sophisticated or complex weapon. The other reason that we would kill them is we left all the food back with the other people. And so we would have to rely on that protein as one of our only protein sources. We were too busy during sugar bush. You didn't have time to go set traps. You didn't have time to go and hunt. You had to get the sugar made, right? Now, as the sap flows up the trees and the ice starts to break up, the birds begin to return in great numbers, allowing us the opportunity to hunt the ducks, geese, and other waterfowl as they come back and as the season gets easier. Like starting up your sugar bush for the beginning of the year, oh man, it's a lot of work. But by the second, third, or fourth week, you're just boiling sap, collecting some new firewood. It's a lot easier as the machine gets running. You can leave the machine to run for itself for a while. So you can go out and hunt then. But at the beginning, you need that porcupine meat. Now, maple sugar is processed into cones or granulated into a rich yellow golden sugar. Those cones are pieces of birch bark that are cut into semicircles, folded up into a cone, and then stitched along the flat side. And then you pour the molten sugar into them, and it solidifies in that cone. If there's a string attached to the narrow end of the cone, you can carry them all in a bundles over your back. Each cone could be about the equivalent of size because you're going to be cutting the same cones. You're basically making a bunch of templates. And now you have a currency that we traded, like the maple sugar from the Ganaraska region, which is down beside me about 40 minutes away. There was a sugar cone found down in an Anasazi Pueblo, which is down in New Mexico, that was 3,200 years old. Like our trade networks for our sugar went very, very far. 200 miles away, actually more than that, over in Arizona, there was actually monomen harvested in the Kawartha Lakes found in another Anasazi Pueblo. So we traded vast amounts of food into vast different directions. So the granulating of maple sugar was done for personal use, and the cones were used for later use. So like we would granulate sugar right there on the spot to use for making, everything from nut breads and monomen flour breads all the way to sweetening our foods or just eating it. Granulating requires a basswood trough and a wooden paddle to stir it as it's molten, and as it cools down, you keep granulating and rubbing it against itself so it can't form up into solid clumps. You get this real light, fluffy, so delicious, so delicious I can't even pronounce the word delicious, food that can be contributed into a lot of different dishes. So in these photos, you can see there's a sugaring trough with maple sugar. Down here, we have two types of taps. So up here, there's a modern tap with a steel or metal spile going into a metal bucket. Down below, we have a birch bark bucket that was folded right there on the spot with what's called a hatchet tap, which is just using the edge of your axe and slashing the tree very gently to cause it to start to bleed out. And then it pours down onto this slat of wood, this piece of cedar right here called a spile, and it drips into there. Up above, you can see a Canada goose that we shot during the springtime, and then we hung it from the same ridge pole that these big pots are hanging off of. And those are all of our pots full of sap. Traditionally, it was done with clay pots. Nowadays, we use cast iron cauldrons or modern evaporators. Meme Bene Gizis, the suckerfish moon, one of Ben's favorite times of year. This is the time to go out. So as the ice leaves the lakes and the sing-song of birds and spring peeper frogs begin to creep across the woods, the fish begin to spawn. walleye, white sucker, red horse, chub suckers, and smelter in large numbers in fast-moving creeks, streams, rivers, and lake shores. Fiddleheads, wild ramps, sunchokes, and dozens of other spring edibles emerge from the nearly thawed ground. So this could be late March into mid-April, or this could be mid-April into late May, depending on where you are in the region. But Namibineg Gizus, in my experience, is usually around mid-March into mid-April for where I live. It could be much later, further up, just as everything else, everything's regional specific. So there's one of my nephews with his very first sucker that he got about 4 years ago, and he was still a little kid, and I was a teenager. This is my cousin picking wild leeks with me, wild ramps, back in 2019. Down here, you can see a bunch of, I believe those are steelheads that we got on the same night that my nephew got that sucker. And that's a big sunchoke root. That's one sunchoke root. And in that one patch, I was pulling on average 30 pounds per square foot of sunchokes. Like, they are a very dependable food source in the springtime. And they're so close to the surface that they can be pulled out before it's fully thawed. They're right there waiting for you. So there's a lot of food that time of year. There's a lot of things you can be getting done, making your fishing spears, going out and finding these plants, preserving these foods. A lot of people are often like going out spearing walleye, spearing salmon, going out with nets to get smelt. I'm a big sucker for sucker. And I think that kind of makes sense because that's the sucker fish moon. That's Namibineg Gizus is what I love to spear and what I love to preserve. I absolutely love suckerhead soup. I absolutely love smoked sucker. It's one of my favorite meals to have, and I often treat it by taking salt, the maple sugar I made the month before, and those leeks that are in that basket right there. I dry the leeks, grind them up with the salt, mix that with the sugar, and then use that as a cure on my sucker. And then I hang them in the smokehouse and I smoke them. And it is, you can make it really strong and it basically becomes fish candy. That's not my thing. I like the really subdued sweetness because sucker is already a sweet tasting meat. It's a really fatty meat too, and you're getting a lot of energy out of that fish. Zalge-Bagagizis, the budding or flowering moon. Now, as the mosquitoes and black flies are starting to wake up, the flowers begin to erupt across the forests and meadows. Has anybody ever heard of a serviceberry tree? Yeah. The Canada serviceberry, the Eastern serviceberry is another name for it. You'll see these white, almost like apple blossoms throughout the woods in late April into May. Usually the first week of May, you're guaranteed to see these flowers all through the woods, especially on the edges of the woods. The reason for them being called serviceberry is they're actually telling us something about the ground below them. See, it takes a long time for the ground to freeze, right? Like, even when the snow first falls, it doesn't usually stay because the ground's still so warm. And then it takes sometimes as late as the winter solstice before it becomes actually difficult to dig holes in the ground. Serviceberry is telling us something. One of the things it's telling us, first and foremost, is that the ground is finally fully thawed, at least 6 feet deep. And that's where the English name serviceberry comes from, because now in early May, it's easy to dig deep enough to make the graves for the funeral service. See, even English names have uses. You just got to really dig into them and really understand what the heck they're talking about. Whereas our names for these plants are very straightforward. So the serviceberries are flowering. The apple trees are flowering, including our native crab apples. A lot of beautiful flowers are starting to come out. We've already gone through our hepaticas. We're probably dealing with dogtooth violets, also known as trout lilies. They're all blossoming. May apple is starting to blossom at this time of year. The May apple being also known as the American mandrake. Very toxic plant, but it's beautiful flower, beautiful plant, one of my favorites. The bark of certain tree species begin to become easier to peel without the need of hot water. So into May is when we start to peel elm trees. It's when we can start to peel birch bark again without having to use hot water. Basswood, even to an extent. Basswood you can peel in the wintertime if you got the heat, but in the springtime around early May, you can peel it right off the tree fairly easily. It gets even easier though later on. This is also the time of planting the gardens. Sunchokes, beans, squash, corn, and dozens of other plant foods were grown in simple, sustainable plots along river floodplains. We didn't do the big industrial crop growing like the Haudenosaunee south of us did. We would choose spots that made the most sense to grow, plant all the foods, leave some teenagers there to watch over it for the growing season, and then we would go on to our fish camps in the for the summertime. So on the left, you can see squash, beans, and corn all coming up out of the ground around the same time. Not actually the right way to plant those three, because the squash will overtake the beans, which are also going to overtake the corn. You kind of want to stagger the growing, but I digress. On the right, you can see me and my good friend Brian peeling basswood bark in late May, early June. And then up here is a process of taking that basswood bark fiber and turning it into a filter bag that would be used later the next year in our sugar bush to strain out and filter our sap. Odeum Gises, the strawberry moon. The first berry of the season arrives. While blueberries bloom, black flies and deer fly swarms get stronger. Like, you know, May is bad, but June is worse when it comes down to those bugs. Like the deer flies fully wake up by June, and they know you're there and they want your blood. But all the bark of all the tree species become effortless to remove from the tree. You can walk up. My favorite thing to do with a student is right after a thunderstorm, walk up to a birch tree and slash it once and walk away. Have a smoke, drink a coffee, whatever, for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then walk back, and you'll wonder who peeled the tree for you. The tree peeled itself. It's incredible when that sap is agitated. You got to remember that the sap is electrolytes. That sap in those trees is an electrolyte solution. So when that static electricity from a thunderstorm rages through and passes, it's so agitated that it's literally floating. And it takes a few hours for it to settle back down and attach again to the phloem. So you can walk up and slash the tree and give it like 10, 15 minutes, and it just starts to peel open and fall off. It's such an easy time to get materials. In the top left photo, I'm peeling a basswood log, and the look on my face is because we were on a hill here and the log rolled and the bark stayed right after I slashed it. And I was just dumbfounded because it just rolled away from me. And then that bark was used to build a wigwam. This is a cedar bark and basswood bark wigwam down here. These are my friends Keith and Matt. And I put these photos in here specifically because we were picking these strawberries while we were up at Chris and Laura's about 4 years ago. This was in a patch where we were going, Chris and Laura were showing us this really cool spot to dig spruce root, and we found this massive patch of wild strawberry, Odeum. And Keith and Matt couldn't help themselves. They just had to start gorging on them like a bunch of bunnies. Mean Gises, the berry moon. This is like June into July or May into, May into June, depending again on where you are. In my area, it's July. This is Mean Gises, the berry moon. And it's not just blueberries. People think it's just talking about blueberries. It's talking about all the berries. Fruits such as blueberries, red currants, raspberries, blackberries, bunchberry, black currants, choke cherries all begin to ripen. Other fruits such as that May apple we talked about earlier, pawpaw and apples begin to form or beginning to ripen as well. So the May apple and the pawpaw and the apple could be the American crab apple or the domestic apple tree are forming by mid-July. And then they'll be ready in August, September, October, depending on the species. Top photo is wild blueberries we picked over near Frontenac a couple years ago. Bottom right, these are 2 gallons of choke cherries that I got off of one tree. In the right conditions, choke cherries produce bumper crops regularly. I think it's a 2 to 3 year cycle for choke cherries. For oaks, the acorns, it can be a 7 to 10 year cycle between a bumper crop and the next bumper crop. Choke cherry, it's 2 to 3 years. So much so that before the industrialization of the blueberry, choke cherry was the predominant fruit of the Northern Hemisphere. Siberia, all of Eurasia, North America, choke cherry was the food. We end up getting 7 gallons of choke cherries in one day from 4 trees. 7 gallons. And that stuff has everything in it you need other than protein, and even has some protein in it. And when we get together in the fall, hopefully if I have enough choke cherries left over, we may be able to do some processing of choke cherries in person to show you how to actually preserve them as a food, because they have a ton of pectin in them. The thing is, they're stones, the pits inside them, just like a cherry stone. They are a cherry. Has, I can never pronounce it, but it's basically prinic acid. And when that prinic acid hits the hydrochloric acid of your stomach, it becomes hydrocyanide. It becomes deadly. So if you take a choke cherry and eat it raw and chew up the pit and swallow the whole thing, you can get very sick, if not dead. But our ancestors were intelligent. Our ancestors were geniuses. If you crush the stones inside the chokecherry with the chokecherry berry itself, it does this amazing thing. The prunic acid gets neutralized by the alkalinity of the chokecherry. And as it starts to dry, the hydrocyanide dehydrates and leaves. And then whatever hydrocyanide remains, you have these cakes that you've made that are kind of like real chubby pancakes. They almost look like scone, but red. And you take that scone that's not scone and you cook it on the embers of your fire and you just toast it. And you turn it regularly, like every 10, 15 seconds. You don't want to leave it on there for too long because it can burn quickly because it's all sugar. And all of the remaining hydrocyanic acid is destroyed. All the prunic acid is fully destroyed. There's nothing in there to hurt you. And now you're getting access to the fats that are inside that fruit. Now you're getting access to the proteins that are inside that fruit. Those seeds are just like an egg. They hold all the nutrients that plant needs to grow. So we have figured out how to dehydrate and process that fruit to give us all the nutrients we need from it. It's an incredible fruit. The photo on the left is a little pawpaw tree I found in my garden after we threw some pawpaw seeds back there, forgot about them. Fishing and the hunting of frogs, turtles, and other marsh critters are the main proteins of this time period. So we're still going to fishing. Ben doesn't have to feel left out. We're still going out and catching fish, making sure that we're getting all those good proteins. We're also going after animals like frogs, turtles. We have turtle traps. We have frog gigs, all that kind of stuff going on. But this is really the time of year for berries. This leads us into one of my favorite times of year. So from mid-July into mid-August is mean geeses. Now we get into Menominee geeses. It's my favorite. And so I made sure that I made 2 slides because it's that important to me. Everything else got 1 slide and I had to condense it. This one I'm going to give it 2 because it's that important. Menomin, also known as Zizania palustris in our region, is also known as wild rice, is a grain that can be harvested and processed with little effort and in great volumes. Rice Lake used to have experienced a sustainable annual harvest of 620,000 pounds from its waters. Menomin has a good balance of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, all the while being rich in HDL, which is aka the healthy cholesterol or good cholesterol, making it a vital food to balance the high LDL or bad cholesterol levels of a meat-rich meal or a meat-rich diet. So these are my great-grandfathers, and in the distance, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather off in the distance there in the Menomin patch. This is just basically taken right in front of where the gas station is here in Hiawatha now. They're out harvesting Menomin. And you notice that the gentlemen that are in the front of the canoes aren't holding ricing sticks or paddles. They're holding something else that came along later in technologically. That is a firearm. So Menominee geesis, along with Menomin, the harvesters are able to catch fish, waterfowl, shorebirds, water mammals such as muskrat and beaver. Now, muskrat live in high volume in Menomin patches. So they average about 1 muskrat per bushel harvested. So if you have 10,000 bushels taken out of a lake, there's approximately 10,000 muskrats living in that lake. So you can quickly connect the dots of how easy this can become a food source. Turtles, frogs, and other animals are also caught during the time of ricing. As for other water plants, we would gather the seed bulbs of the yellow pond lily, the tubers of arrowroot plants, and dozens of other plant foods. Now, the skills and the bushcraft that has to surround this time of year, you need to know how to light a fire, obviously, because you got to be able to parch the Menomin. You need to be able to carve to shape your push pole or your paddle, your ricing sticks. You have to know how to build a canoe, right? We could probably get by for most of the summer without a canoe. You can't easily harvest Menomin without a canoe, and you need to harvest Menomin. Menomin is a primary staple. It's not just something that you want to have in your diet. It's a necessity if you're living on the land. Wild rice or Menomin gives you almost every micro and macronutrient you need other than enough protein and omega-3 fatty acids. It's got a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, but you need a little bit more. So having that fish, that muskrat, that duck, that goose. But the Menomin is easy to keep. It's easy to process. It's easy to store. This is your main crop for the year. So if we were going to go back to that question of when would be the best time to get dropped off, I suppose Menominee geesis, if you get dropped off right as it's beginning, but only if you get dropped off with a canoe. And only if you're really, really, really good at hunting and trapping, because this is going to be the only plant food you have time to really get before the season really kicks off into high gear. This one always gets me. It's hard for me. I didn't grow up speaking my language, so this one always throws me off. It's a bit of a tongue twister at the back of my throat. Wabaga. Yeah, I already did it. Wabog baga geezes. Leaves turning color moon. As the maples and sumacs begin to show their bright red trails in the canopy, we begin to focus on hunting methods. It needs to be made very clear that prior to contact, the act of killing big game was something that had to be taken very seriously and often was reserved for wintertime when the snow was deep enough that it could be used to our advantage. So much so that we actually had what was referred to as a moose chief, Moose Gima, and sometimes referred to as Muzake Gima, or the person that knows how to lead a hunt on moose. And that's because they are brutal animals when they want to be. I'm not sure if any of you have ever been chased by a moose. I've been chased 3 times in my lifetime, and all 3 times I was on the verge of tears when I got away from them. I was so freaking lucky that my chubby butt was able to get away from them. The one time because I got to a canoe in time, another time because I had a friend with me who kept on running, so the moose got distracted and went after them. And the third time, there was just so many of us. By the end of it, the moose gave up and took off into the lake. But I've got a lot of horror stories of what these animals can do if they are pushed, if you give them a reason. And a bull moose is a cantankerous creature. They are nearsighted and short-tempered. They're when talking with outdoors experts in our field and beyond, I'll often ask, what's the one animal that you actually have a lot of fear of? And they'll say, well, I have a healthy respect for the wolves and the bears, and if you leave them alone, they leave you alone, but I won't mess with a moose. That's a very wise thing to think. Going up against a bull moose in the rut with a spear, atlatl dart, or arrow is a very high risk, which is just something our ancestors weren't interested in doing. Small game fishing and trapping is a much safer choice, especially while the marshes and frozens remain unfrozen. It's much easier to go after those smaller animals. Down in Texas, somewhere in West Texas, there was a cave dwelling that was found, and they found human coprolites. For those of us that don't know what a coprolite is, that's a dried out or desiccated or mummified or even fossilized poop. And so they were able to break it apart. They were estimated about 2,500 years old, and they were able to actually break down the feces and figure out exactly what was consumed. Not one of them ate anything larger than a raccoon out of like 30 droppings that they had found in that cave. Not one person ate anything larger than a raccoon. Texas has a lot of deer. So that's something to take into consideration. If you're in an area that's really hard to hunt fast-footed animals, you're probably not going to hunt fast-footed animals until you have a weapon that's faster than the fast-footed animal. Bows are challenging in open country, even with modern archery tackle. It's hard enough to get a deer with a rifle. You talk about your ancestors with an atlatl or a bow or a hand spear. It's just really challenging to do. You got to wait until that deep snow to really get the advantage on them. Due to this, trapping methods were often employed to make the capture and killing of a moose or elk safer and more successful. And that's right, I said trapping. There is a phenomenal book that I can send an email when we get the reading list and everything else together for everybody of what they want to learn. There's a phenomenal book by a gentleman named John Montgomery Cooper called, it's a long title, and you know it's an ethnography because it's a long title. It was clearly an old white man in the 1930s that wanted to make sure everyone knew he was the smartest man around. It was titled Snares, Deadfalls, and Other Traps of the Northern Algonquian and Northern Athabascan. And in there, they show Cree moose snares. Like, we're excited to go snare rabbits today. Our ancestors were using snares on a moose. We snared bear, we snared beaver, we snared wolves, we snared elk, we snared everything that could move. Snares are incredible, which is why I'm excited to teach some of that stuff in the near future with this program. Not the moose snares. We're going to focus on rabbit snares at first and move our way up as the years go. Or else you end up like this gentleman in this picture here. Benaquegis is the falling leaves moon. As the leaves drop from the trees, so do matigamin. Oh, yeah, okay, we're in the right time. As leaves drop from the trees, so do matigamin, acorns, and other tree nuts. These are rich in fat and proteins while also being able to be stored for long periods to enrich the winter diet. Acorn, walnut, butternut. The American chestnut at one time was a primary food staple of our people. Now, much of in the last 150 years, since the chestnut blight hit our shores in the late 1800s, I would say that the acorn has been adopted by a lot of Eastern nations that wouldn't have eaten acorn as much as they did chestnut. Chestnut was a massive food staple because it had an earlier cycle. Again, going back to those oaks, they have a 7 to 10 year, depending on species and region, a 7 to 10 year bumper crop cycle. Chestnuts have a 2 year bumper crop cycle, and they produce a massive amount of mast or a ton of nuts. So an incredible, incredible food source. This time of year, this would be, October going into November. And depending on the teaching, some people say from full moon to full moon. Some people say from new moon to new moon is how our moons go. I go with whatever seems to line up with when those things are available, when these resources and these relations are coming to us. This is also the time of year to be preparing for the wintertime, to start getting everything psyched up and ready. So I'm going to start getting wood cut to make my snowshoes. I'm going to start getting materials to start getting ready to make toboggans. I'm going to start getting everything ready right around now because this is also one of the most plentiful times. This is also our harvest time. Corn, beans, squash, another batch of sunchokes. You can harvest sunchokes twice a year, which is pretty exciting, as long as you got multiple patches to go to or a really large patch to go to. All those foods are being harvested, pulled in from the landscape or gathered from the landscape. It's really easy to sit back and start to work on things and get things ready for future. So we're going to start getting our cattail mats made to make our wigwam covers. We're going to start getting our moccasins. So the moccasins that you danced in during the ricing period, because we have to dance on the monoman to get it processed, those moccasins, those would be the very first time you wore those moccasins. Your auntie or your wife or your sibling or yourself would make those moccasins for ricing season, and then you would dance in those moccasins on top of the monoman to process them, because you want those soles to be fresh, clean moccasins. You do not want to be stepping on that monoman right after you were stepping on the goose turds that were in the grass around where you were dancing. It's not going to end well. So you want brand new, clean moccasins, and then those would be your winter moccasins. Those would be what you wore through the winter time to trap, to run in your snowshoes, everything else you have to do to hunt those moose, everything else. So this is the time of year to get all that stuff prepared as we come into later on. So as the plant foods are all gathered up, dried and packaged away, we see another part of food systems come into play, trapping. 2 medium-sized raccoons are the equivalent of 1 deer in meat. I learned that from my friend Delphine. She's a Anishinabek originally from Wemkong, but lives up in North Bay area, and she worked with her former partner for 1 whole year to live off just what they could off the land. They wouldn't eat anything that they didn't pick, catch, trap, or otherwise gather themselves. If they couldn't get it themselves because of their region, they would trade for it from stuff that they harvested as well or gathered themselves. And in that year, they did a ton of research and data analysis and stuff. And one of them they came to is if you butcher an entire raccoon, 1 medium to large raccoon is equivalent in meat volume as half a deer. So which is easier to get? How many of us hunt deer? Sorry, how many of us go sit in the woods for 2 weeks hoping a deer shows up? How many of us actually get the deer? It's not that common as much as we'd like it to be. But how easy is it? I set on a regular basis, I'll set 7 raccoon traps in the first week of trapping season, which is in my area, October 25th, roughly. Actually, no, raccoon I set in October 5th because that's when their season opens up here. Raccoon trapping, I'll get 5 raccoons out of 5 traps in the first week, guaranteed, if not more. Guaranteed. So traps hunt 24/7, regardless of the weather. Traps do not get tired, cold, or hungry. So when it comes down to effort of harvesting, trapping reigns supreme. A single large beaver can be the equivalent of 1 moose hindquarter in meat. I pulled out a 65-pound beaver last year out of my trap line. I've got a friend up in Manitoulin Island that took a 112-pound and 6-ounce beaver. They get big. There's a lot of meat on that animal and a lot of fat on that animal. And that gets us into Bushcraft, the freezing moon. As the ice begins to form, fur and meat become top priorities. From float test analysis and the study of coprolites, it has been mostly accepted that small game was the primary source of mammal meat in pre-contact times. Squirrels, hares, rabbits, muskrats, beaver, raccoon, opossums, groundhogs, porcupines, and other small, low-risk, high-reward meals were highly esteemed and could make up 80% of the meat sources of the Anishinabek diet, the other 20% being divided up between birds, fish, big game, and reptiles and amphibians. So in these photos, you can see there's 2 beaver I caught. This is an optical illusion. I don't want you to get too excited. That's the beaver a lot closer than my friend is in the photo, I promise. This is the beaver being cooked. This is several geese I got several years ago. These are gray squirrels, also black morph gray squirrels or black squirrels. This is the time to get protein. They're done breeding. They're done raising their young. Now it's time to kill them for food. Manado Gizons, this is around December solstice, give or take, like winter solstice. The little spirit moon, Manado Gizons. With all of the food harvested for the year, much of the first part of winter was spent celebrating, telling stories, playing games, and otherwise feasting. This is also when you start finishing up the making of your snowshoes, weaving the frames together for the upcoming deep snow that would be happening at this time. This is when we start playing Joshaman or Snow Snake. This is when we start playing hand games and moccasin games. This is the time that we start telling stories. In our traditional teachings, we're taught to not talk about certain beings in the summertime and the growing season. One of them is Winanabojo, or Winabojo, or Nanabojo, or Nanabush, depending on your dialect. And it's because he's resting. Like if you were sleeping in a spare room at a friend's place or at your own house and you have guests over and they keep talking about Chris, and they keep saying Chris's name, Chris is going to keep waking up and being like, what the hell do they want? Why are they talking about me? And just like Chris, they're going to get irritated, those Manadawak, those spirits. And so you don't want to irritate them when they're sleeping or else they'll come out and play mischief.
Were you just saying something about me, Caleb? I was sleeping there. What were you saying?
Exactly. See, my point is made. And so just like Chris, when Anaboja would play tricks on you, would punish you, would actually would prank you and make your life difficult. This time of year, December, January into February, this time of winter is when they're awake. They're active, they're doing their things. And so it's okay to tell stories about them. And this is when you hear a lot of our traditional stories being taught is while that snow is on the ground. Some people will even say that you're not supposed to say the name of Winanabojo unless there's snow on the ground. The teaching I heard for that was if you do, you'll wake up to a frog sucking on your toe. Like, it's weird, but it doesn't sound like a horrible punishment. It just sounds like it'd be one of those things like I wouldn't be able to explain it to anybody. That's a pretty clever prank or like punishment because like how would I explain what just happened? People would think I'm crazy. So it's perfect. It's a perfect punishment. So this is when we start telling the stories is during Menando Gizons. This is when we get together. And this is also the last, time that everybody stays together because as we're gathering, the ice is starting to freeze up thicker and thicker and thicker, making it safe to travel into our northern territories, into those family trapping grounds again. Gitchimanado Gizis, the Great Spirit Moon, which is right about now, actually. The full moon just happened, I believe, Monday. Today's Wednesday. So as the snow drifts deeper and deeper, the snowshoe-clad hunter can now outmaneuver the dangerous moose and the fleet-footed deer and the cautious elk. The use of team drives with dogs to harass the quarry allows the hunter to push their prey to the deepest drifts and leave them floundering while carefully aimed arrows are let loose or a stout long spear thrust deep into the vitals. This is when big game hunting was the most logical and safest of tactics. And if you look at a lot of old journals, you see those stories of they would wait until the snow was deep to go after those animals. There's a great documentary. If any of you want to get a good view of what a winter life of the indigenous people of our territories was like, there's a great documentary from Quebec on the National Film Board website called Cree Hunters of the Mistassini. And it's of 3 families living together for the trapping season. And throughout it, they're trying to live off rabbit and beaver. And then they just say enough is enough. And they go out and get those moose. Makwa Gises, the bear moon, also known as Balkade Gises, the hunger moon. This is like January into February. As the bear constellation leaves the bear's den constellation, we are reminded this time of year that if we gathered enough food throughout the year, this season would be seeing us resting like the bear. Otherwise, we will have to resort to famine food to survive until springtime. This is the deepest part of the winter. This is like January into February is the coldest, deepest part of winter time. And because of that, it's the hardest time to find foods. And if you didn't prepare enough, if you didn't, build up for the season, you end up relying on famine food. Has anybody ever heard of the Adirondack Mountains down in New York State? Comes from the Mohawk or Nodaway word Ratarontak. It means the bark eaters. And they're describing Anishinabek people because we were stuck in those mountains with not enough food. And they watched us and witnessed us peeling the bark off of trees just to get by, like giant two-legged beaver. One of the oldest teachings I received as a youth when I began to learn to trap from elders was to always leave the beaver nearest to my camp alone. Don't trap them. Don't touch them. Wherever your camp is, the closest beaver ponds, you leave them alone. You don't go after them. If I failed to catch enough game or gather enough crops, I would rely on these nearby beaver, even if I was exhausted from hunger, to save me. But if I killed them early on in my greed for fur, I would be the one suffering and dying of starvation. Beyond neighbor beavers, Anishinabek would rely on the cambiums of birch, pine, poplar, maple, and basswood to keep us alive. These fiber-rich inner barks would be stewed and the broth drank, while the strips of bark were treated like tough noodles. So you cut them across the grain, kind of like sawing through a log, and that makes it a lot easier to chew. If you leave them like long strips like you would peeling off the tree, it's like chewing long strips that you just peel off a tree. It just never gets digested. Our last month, on deck Gises, it's also got the most names. On deck Gises, the crow moon, Onabden Gises, the snow crust moon, and down here in Mississauga territory, Mississauga Guaquin, we call it Bolpogama Gises, the broken snowshoes moon. As the days begin to get longer, the days will warm up while the nights stay cold. This forms a crust on the snow, making it easier to walk in snowshoes. It's also, oddly enough, the harshest conditions for snowshoes because the crust starts to abrade the lacings of the rawhide. As this crust, I'm just going to move our chat box here. As this crusty snow forms, we will also notice the crows arriving in fields around the lake shore. Less will we hear the deeply varied quirks and plonks of the northern ravens, and more we'll hear the hardy and voracious caws of the crows. I was trying to be poetic there. One day I'll feel like a real poet, but not right now. It is now the sugar bush season, aka Anishinabek New Year, and we come back to the sugar bush. So that is, in general, how the 13 moons work. Now, depending on where you are, depending on the time of year, depending on the conditions, those may change. Last year, our sugar bush should have started in January. Frankly, like if I actually wanted to get enough sugar to last the year, I should have started tapping now because that was when it started to run. And then our good friends over in Rama First Nation, they said enough is enough. We're tapping in February, and they tapped on February 4th. And I think they're one of the few communities I know that actually had a successful harvest of maple syrup last year. And they got a pretty good yield, and they got like 5 weeks out of the year. Whereas here I only tapped February 21st, I believe, and I got a gallon of maple syrup because we missed it. We missed the window. So the seasons change because a lot of things. The number one thing that we can't deny is climate change. It's affecting a lot of how our ways of life were. This past spring, I went up to harvest to catch smelt with Chris and Laura, and we went by the teachings that Chris had received about listening for those spring peepers, those frogs. That sound tells you that in a couple of days, the smelt are going to start running up the creeks. He called me, and I could hear the spring peepers in the background. He's like, dude, they're going. We got up there, no smelt. I caught like, how much would you say? Like the bottom of the bucket, Chris? Yeah, like that much of a bucket worth. The 2 years before, we filled up 2 or 3 buckets before we even said to call it quits. And then a week and a half later, Chris calls me. He's like, dude, they just started running now. Things are changing. This year has been a very strict, this year, especially for me, has been like hit home of how much this calendar of ours can kind of get knocked out of sway. And we got to really start to become, as Anishinaabe, we've got to really start to become observers again to start seeing this new change that's happening to our landscape so that we can continue to learn. So that's the presentation. I figured I would try to keep it tight and sweet, short and sweet, and we can actually have a little bit of time for any questions, if we have any comments, if we have any stories, or anybody wants to ask anything in detail. I do see some stuff in the chat box.
Yeah, and if anybody has received teachings and even wants to add any layers or anything, feel free to share or ask questions. Just, you can either unmute yourself or you can throw it in the chat.
Am I Lauren's brother? Yes. Lauren Musgrave, also known as Lauren Mold, that's my older sister. She works at FNTI. I'm guessing you're a student at FNTI, or you knew her before FNTI?
Yeah, actually, and she's great. Just I love Lauren.
I love Lauren too, which is really ideal because she's my older sister, so it's nice when I can love her as well. Right on.
Wow, we're actually early, Caleb. That might be the only time that
don't jinx it. Don't jinx it.
I know, sorry. I don't know if Caleb and I have ever been early on a presentation we've done together before in history. Usually it's the other way around.
Yep.
Hey, Caleb, can I request a story? I don't know if you're up for it or not. I'm kind of putting you on the spot here. Yeah, from you.
Sure.
I was thinking about it. Seems kind of appropriate because you were talking about hunting in the winter times. And I remember a couple times I've heard you tell the story of the placement of the Big Dipper as it relates to where it stands in the sky and the teachings around the hunting. Would you be open to sharing that? I think that might maybe be a beautiful one to close us out with tonight.
I kind of hinted at it in the slides when I was talking about Buckaday Geesis and the Bear Moon. This is a teaching I received. It's a depending on where you are in our territory, the Ursa Major constellation, the Big Dipper, can be often referred to as the Fisher or the Great Bear. And Ursa Major is talking about the Great Bear as well. Ursa being bear, major being the great, and then minor being the lesser. The bear constellation, Ursa Major, is talking about, in our language, when we're talking about that bear, the cup is the bear. So you got those 4 stars that make the cup, and they're running across the sky being chased by the tail, which is 3 stars, which make up the 3 hunters. Now, in Cree teachings, those 3 hunters are a jay, a cardinal, and another bird. In Haudenosaunee traditions, it's 3 human hunters. In our stories, it's 3 human hunters as well, though in Northwestern Ontario, I've heard a hybridization of it's like birds that are also humans. Anyways, the way it works is come the full moon of February, basically the bear moon, you'll see this other constellation near the horizon, which is Corona Borealis, the northern crown. And Corona Borealis in our language translates to the bear's den. I can't remember how to say it in Anishinabek Moon, but it translates to the bear's den. And at that time of year, you see that constellation of Ursa Major start running away from Corona Borealis across the night sky. And come to September, you find Ursa Major, the Great Bear, on his back. And at that exact time, around the full moon of September, you see all the maple leaves and all the sumac leaves start to streak with blood red coloring. And so the teaching I was taught was, as you watch that bear run across the sky, you're not supposed to hunt big game anymore. As soon as that bear starts to move, you leave the big game alone. The deer, the elk, the moose, the bison out west, the deer, the white-tailed deer, the bear itself, any of those animals, you leave them alone as that bear runs across the sky. And as it arrives on its back, it's been killed by the hunters and its blood pours down on those trees. And when you see that blood hit the trees, then you know it's a time to start to hunt again. And the reason being I was taught was we always try to aim for the bucks and the bulls, right? We don't want to take those cows or does that are carrying babies. And so we try to leave them alone. Well, what happens by February with the bucks and the bulls? The antlers fall off. It's harder to discern which one it is. Now, if you know your animals really well, it's not hard to tell a bull from a cow moose. The sheer size alone usually tells you. If you go, holy crap, that's a bull, right? if you actually, it's like, holy crap, that's a cow. If you go, oh my God, that's a bull. That's more like better details. Kind of like when you hear like how to tell the difference between a crow and a crow and a raven. When you go, my God, that's too big to be a crow. That's a crow. When you go, what is that giant black monstrosity? That's a raven. Like they're just so much bigger than those other birds. They're so much bigger than the cow. But if you're if you're kind of in a clinch and you have your gun and you see that moose and you don't see the antlers, it may be hard to discern if that's a bull or a cow. And so we stop hunting them when that bear starts to move across the sky. And as that bear runs across the sky from February all the way to September, we stop hunting big game in general. And then when we see that blood pour onto those leaves, then we know it's safe to start hunting again, because those young will be able to survive without their parents now. Whether it's a calf moose, a fawn deer, no matter what the animal is, they will be able to survive because they've evolved to survive without their parents by fall time. Awesome. That's the general purpose, the general gist of it.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Caleb. Appreciate you letting me put you on the spot. Maybe just to bring us back to the start of the call tonight, and then I will end with just a couple logistical pieces. But we started off this call, I invited everybody to close their eyes and think about where the moon was in the sky, picture where it is in its cycle right now. You can also do that with the stars right now. And one beautiful thing, well, really any time of the year, but maybe one thing I'll encourage you is a little bit of a homework piece between now and when we get together in a couple of weeks on the land in person, is maybe think about a couple of evenings in a row, or maybe even just a couple times a week, going out at the exact same time after the sun's gone down and looking at the sky and seeing where is Ursa Major, the Big Dipper in the sky, where are those other constellations? But let's focus on the Ursa Major there, the Great Bear in the sky. What's its positioning right at sundown or right after sundown in the sky? And if you notice, if you go and look at it right now, basically we're in that time where it's kind of been up tall with the hunters behind it, and it's actually starting to turn. So at sunrise, basically, or just after sunrise every night, it's almost facing up and down. And if you go and see that now, and you go back and see that multiple nights, you can imagine by February how it's actually going to be fully on its back. So just a little bit of an invitation, right? Because the stars, so let's say January 15th, every single year at around January, the stars are going to be positioned in the same way right at sunset, right? And then they're going to basically move the whole rest of the night. But by tomorrow night, they're going to be back in that position again. And then a year from now, they're going to be back in that position again. And then we can track that throughout the year. So if you haven't started to kind of familiarize yourself with how the stars move around the North Star Polaris, and how it relates to the story and how that can actually be a calendar, then maybe there's a fun little piece to really think about connecting with the moon and the stars, and to pick the same time every night to go look will probably help you with that. Once you've patterned in what it looks like at, say 7 p.m., then maybe go out at 10 or go out at midnight or go out at 6 in the morning and see where they've moved. And there's just a fun little piece to collect us with the celestial beings and celestial relationships until we meet again. I do want to go over just a couple logistical pieces. So as I mentioned, these calls are going to happen once a month online. And then there is the in-person gathering on the land. Ben, do you mind just reminding us of the address and the location of the in-person gathering?
Yeah, so if you're from Rama, you know it as Gawaden K, but the green address is 7098 Rama Road. And we're in the Couchiching building. We were going to do the Birch Hall, but we don't have washrooms or heat. So we have washrooms and heat in the Couchiching building. Were you going to ask about everyone on this call's attendance? Was that the direction that we were going?
We would like to, yeah, we would like to get an idea ahead of time who's going to be attending the in-person sessions, just because we're going to have to prepare materials and stuff each month. We haven't actually figured out what the best system is so watch for an email from either Ben or myself. But it would be helpful for us if you have an idea that you're going to make it or you can't make one, to let us know, just so we can kind of plan. Well, we need to plan meals and food and coffee and stuff. And then we also need, Caleb and I need to plan supplies. So just that would be helpful to know ahead of time. Quick little logistical reminder, just watch, if you didn't get that email from me, Chris Outdoors already, check your junk mail because I send it to everybody today. So make sure you check it. If you use Gmail, it could be in our promotions. So just a reminder of that. I'll send out the replay through that link as well. If you know people that you think would have enjoyed tonight's talk that weren't here, feel free to share that replay with them. Yeah, and other than that, I hope some of you are feeling inspired tonight to join us on this journey. Ben and Caleb and myself basically have kind of committed to do this for a year, and then we'll kind of see where things land at the end of the year. So it'll be really beautiful to build some momentum, to get to know each other, build those relationships, learn from each other, learn from the land, and walk this good path together. So I hope some of you are inspired. Kathy, were you maybe putting up a hand there? Please.
Miigwech for everything. This is fantastic. I live away. I live out in British Columbia. So obviously I won't be coming to all the monthly gatherings in person. But I am curious if you have any thoughts about doing any in-person, like longer sessions, like a week or 5 days or a weekend kind of thing, because that I could possibly come back for something like that. But I'm just wondering if that would be of interest to anybody, or if you've looked at that as a possibility.
Amazing. So Caleb and I definitely do that already, like both on our own, but then we also run some stuff together. So, you know, maybe reach out and stay in touch. We're actually, Caleb and I are meeting next week to kind of work on the calendar for next year. And there has been talks of potentially doing a larger, longer gathering at Rama down the road. Just initial talks with Ben. I don't know what that looks like yet, so there are no promises at this point, but it's a bit of a dream right now, although there is some talks of that. But Caleb and I will definitely be running some longer classes this summer and fall, like kind of intensives like that. I don't know if you want to speak to anything that, Caleb. And of course, during the Menomin harvest, I think during the ricing time, there's also opportunities to come down and spend some time on the land with that. Anything you want to mention there, Caleb, or did I kind of cover that?
Yeah, we've got, I'll be launching my calendar for the year next week after I meet with Chris. Our website's currently down. We're getting a whole new revamp. We're changing hosts and stuff, so there's nothing on my website currently. But if you follow our social media, both mine and Chris's, so Chris is with Wild Muskoka Botanicals. Him and Laura run an amazing kind of two-headed monster up there where they do cool, amazing herbal foods. Things like some of my favorite things in the world actually is their stuff. They make like this sumac strawberry shrub and all these other amazing like mixers and herbal spices and seasonings you can put on your food. Amazing products. And with that comes like wild food workshops and wild plant workshops that they run. And then Chris and I work together quite a bit when it comes down to programming, like outdoor skills. And then myself, I teach at Canadian Bushcraft. So my company is called Canadian Bushcraft. We have, I think the plan is 30 courses this year that are everything from 1-day classes to 1-week programs. And then we also have a podcast if you're looking for more information, just to get deeper into stuff where I actually get more than an hour to rant. You can find, I think we're at 143 episodes. I think I'm dropping the 144th episode next week at some point when I have time to actually edit what I just recorded on the weekend with Bruce Zawalski, who's a phenomenal dude over in Alberta, who's been teaching for 30 plus years and did a really cool trek that he talks about where he started in Rocky Mountain House and paddled all the way to Thunder Bay in one go, which is like absolutely mind-boggling to me. I used to be a canoe guide up in Algonquin Park, and to think of like a 90-something day trip going upriver most of that time, mind-boggling. A lot of stuff on there. Just look up Canadian Bushcraft on most social media, you'll find us. And as long as TikTok is still on, we're on there as well.
I think that cool. I think that kind of covers us for logistics. I believe it's January 25th, the Saturday, 9:30 a.m. We'll start running about 9:30 to 4:30. You all know the location. Watch for the email follow-up. Any other logistical questions or thoughts, closing comments before we wrap for the night, everyone?
Sorry, when was the date for the meetup?
January 25th, Saturday.
At 9 a.m.?
9:30.
9:30. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll send a follow-up email that actually has because we have the dates for the whole year already mapped out. So I'll send the whole schedule for the year out shortly, so everyone has access to that, and you can kind of plan ahead. But the next one is the 25th.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Well, wonderful, Miigwech. Thank you, everybody. What a lovely night. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. And maybe here's a quick little challenge. What about before you get on to whatever you're doing next? I'd encourage you to step outside, take a breath of fresh air, and go connect with the moon and the Big Dipper, the big bear in the sky right now before you go to bed tonight. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right. Night, everybody.
Thanks,
Right.
Chris.
Chris, you want to hang back for a debrief after, or do you want to just get going?
Hold on. Let me just stop the recording.